This building isn't a line item. It's the only promise in this neighborhood that's never been broken.
That window shape, the little heart in the corner, I drew that on a napkin in New York.
Whatever your Mr. Kwon, it can wait until she's ready. She doesn't owe you a reaction tonight.
3 years ago, Kendra Ashworth walked out of a marriage she never stopped believing in, carrying a secret she promised herself she would protect with everything she had. Tonight, that secret is 30 minutes from daycare pickup, and the man she built an entire second life to avoid is standing 11 feet away from her, breathing like the air in the room has changed. Woojin Kwon did not fly to the States to find her. He flew to save a stalled deal, Kwon Group's waterfront acquisition, and one small, expensive community center his own finance team wanted cut before anyone noticed. He has spent 3 years becoming the kind of CEO his father would have respected, careful, exacting, allergic to surprises. He was not prepared for the woman defending that community center to be the wife his family told him didn't want him anymore. He remembers signing papers in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and fear. His father's heart stopped twice on a table 2 floors up, his grandmother's voice the only steady thing in the room. He remembers believing, completely, that it was the only way to keep his father alive. He does not yet know that somewhere in this city, 2 3-year-olds with his eyes are asleep in a house Kendra built with her own 2 hands. He is about to find out that some promises don't disappear just because someone else decided to break them. The Riverside Commons hearing was supposed to be routine. Kendra Ashworth had given this exact presentation 4 times in 6 months, to City Council, to the Historical Preservation Board, to a room of skeptical investors who cared more about parking ratios than the people who'd actually grown up on this stretch of the Catawba. She knew the rhythm of it by heart, open with the numbers, pivot to the families, close with Haven House. Haven House was the reason she still believed in any of this. A resource center with a free pediatric clinic, an after-school wing, and a rooftop garden her mother would have loved, built into the bones of an old textile mill 3 blocks from where Kendra had grown up. She had drawn its heart-shaped window frames on a napkin a decade ago, before she understood that some drawings you make when you're falling in love become the only thing you have left of the person you loved. This building isn't a line item, she told the room, voice steady even as her stomach tightened at the sight of empty chairs where 2 council members should have been. It's the only promise in this neighborhood that's never been broken. That was when the double doors at the back of the hall opened, and every certainty she'd built her adult life on top of walked in wearing a $5,000 suit. She didn't need to see his face fully to know. She knew the set of his shoulders, the exact economy of how he moved through a room like he was already apologizing for taking up space in it. 3 years hadn't changed that. 3 years hadn't changed the way her whole chest seemed to drop 3 floors when Woojin Kwon stopped just inside the doorway and went completely, utterly still. He wasn't supposed to be here. Kwon Group's acquisition team had sent lawyers, a project director, a woman named Pharaoh who asked good questions and terrible follow-ups. Nobody had said the new CEO would fly in personally to walk a warehouse full of skeptical residents through a deal his own finance department wanted to gut by 40%. Nobody had told her his eyes would find the rendering board before they found her. She watched it happen in real time, watched him take one slow step into the hall and then stop, watched his gaze catch on the building elevation pinned beside her, on the small, unmistakable heart-shaped window frames tucked into the top corner of the facade like a signature. It was such a small detail. She'd fought her own project manager to keep it, had told him it mattered more than he could understand, had never once explained why. Woojin lifted his hand slightly, like he might touch the drawing from 11 feet away. That window shape, he said, so quietly she shouldn't have been able to hear it over the room, and yet she did, the way you hear your own name in a crowded restaurant. The little heart in the corner. I drew that on a napkin in New York. Kendra's hand found the edge of the podium and gripped it like the floor had tilted. For 3 years, she had rehearsed 100 versions of what she would say if she ever saw him again. Not one of them accounted for the fact that in 31 minutes, she was supposed to be 3 miles away, kneeling on a bathroom floor, brushing 2 sets of small teeth that belonged, unmistakably, to him. If second chances, buried truths, and love that refuses to stay buried are the kind of thing that gets you, hit subscribe and stay with light romance stories. Kendra and Woojin's story is just getting started. Woojin requested a private meeting with the project's lead architect the next morning, and it took every professional instinct Kendra owned not to send Talia in her place. She went anyway, because Haven House was worth more than her own comfort, and because some childish, stubborn part of her needed to know if he would say her name out loud or keep pretending, the way he'd apparently been pretending for 3 years that a version of her didn't exist raising his children 40 minutes from downtown. He didn't pretend. The moment she walked into the glass-walled conference room on the 31st floor, he stood so fast his chair rolled back and hit the window. Kendra. Just that. Like he'd been holding the word in his mouth all night and it finally got loose. Mr. Kwon. She kept her voice flat, professional, the same voice she used on contractors who tried to cut corners on load-bearing walls. If she let herself hear the way he said her name, she would remember too much, too fast. They talked about the deal for 40 minutes, and it was, against every prediction she would have made, genuinely useful. He asked sharp questions about the clinic's funding model. He pushed back, correctly, on a phasing timeline that would have left the after-school wing dark for 8 months. He remembered, without being told, that she'd always hated glass conference tables because they made everyone perform instead of think, and had a folder of paper printouts waiting instead of a tablet. It should not have mattered. It mattered anyway. By the third site walk through that week, something old and dangerous had started waking back up between them, not romance, not yet, just the particular ease of working beside someone who had once known exactly how her mind worked. He still finished her sentences about structural load. She still caught herself translating his silences the way she used to, reading the exact millimeter of tension in his jaw that meant he disagreed but wanted to hear her out first. You built this whole thing around a napkin drawing, he said on the 4th day, standing in the half-framed shell of what would become the rooftop garden, wind pulling at his coat. It wasn't a question. I built this whole thing for people who needed it, she said. The window shape was just, she stopped herself, furious at how close she'd come. Just what? Familiar, she said, which was true, and a lie, in the exact proportions she'd been living in for 3 years. He looked at her a beat too long. She'd forgotten how uncomfortable it was to be truly seen by someone, how it felt like standing in front of a window with the lights on behind you. I have somewhere I need to be at 4, she said, checking a phone she hadn't actually looked at, and it wasn't until she was in the elevator, hand pressed flat against the cold steel wall, that she let herself shake. Somewhere, across the city, a daycare teacher was helping 2 3-year-olds into their shoes, and neither of them had any idea that their father had just spent an hour standing 11 feet away from the reason he still couldn't sleep through a full night. The call came at 5:40 on a Thursday, the exact hour Kendra had scheduled a walk-through with Kwon Group's finance team because her usual sitter had promised she was free. She wasn't free. Her voice was apologetic and frantic over the phone, a family emergency, she was so sorry, could Kendra possibly, and there was no possibly about it, because there was no backup, because Talia was in Raleigh for a permit hearing, because this was the exact scenario Kendra had spent 3 years building contingency plans against and somehow, tonight, every single one of them had failed at once. She brought them to the office. She told herself it would be fine, 20 minutes, a coloring book, the finance team wouldn't even come past the reception area. She was wrong about the last part within 11 minutes. Woojin came out of the elevator ahead of schedule, already scanning a document, and stopped so completely that the man behind him nearly walked into his back. Eli looked up first, he always did, more curious than his sister, already halfway out of his chair to investigate the tall stranger, and said, with the total unself-consciousness of a 3-year-old, "You have mommy's building drawing on your tie clip." He didn't. It was a coincidence of geometry, a small architectural pin Kendra had given him years ago that had nothing to do with Haven House and everything to do with a version of him that used to notice things like that about her. But Woojin's hand went to it anyway, and his eyes went from the boy's face to the little girl's, and Kendra watched 3 years of careful math visibly assemble itself behind his eyes. Age. Timeline. The month he'd signed the papers. The month, 9 weeks later, she would have found out. Kendra. His voice had gone somewhere she'd never heard it go, not even in the hospital hallway. How old are they? They need to get home, she said, already gathering backpacks, already failing to look at him. Kendra. 2.5, she said, because lying to his face while her children stood beside her was a line she would not cross, whatever else she'd protected them from. Their names are Eli and Yuna. He said the second name like it had knocked the air out of him, Yuna, a name with roots in a language he hadn't heard her speak in 3 years, chosen, she would never admit out loud, because some part of her had refused to let him disappear from them completely even while she was protecting them from everything else he came with. She got the twins into their coats with hands that didn't shake, because she had promised herself years ago that whatever happened, they would never watch her fall apart. She was almost at the elevator when Eli, tugging his sister's hand, turned back and pointed at Woojin's tie clip one more time. "It's like the windows in Mommy's building," he said. "The heart ones." Woojin didn't move until long after the elevator doors closed. He stood in the empty lobby holding a folder he could no longer read a single word of, doing math that had an answer he wasn't ready for and couldn't unsee. He came to her house at 9 that night, which was either the boldest or the most reckless thing Kendra had ever seen him do, and she almost didn't open the door. She stood in the front hallway with her hand on the frame for a full minute, listening to the twins' white noise machine hum through the baby monitor, before she finally turned the lock. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I know." He looked wrecked in a way 3 years of boardrooms hadn't managed to make him look. "I need you to tell me I'm wrong. Do the math for me and tell me I'm wrong." She didn't invite him in. They stood on the porch in the cold, and she made him wait exactly as long as it took her to decide, one final time, whether protecting the truth was still protecting her children or whether it had quietly become something else. "You're not wrong," she said. He made a sound she'd never heard him make, not quite a word, something that came from somewhere underneath language. He put both hands over his face for a moment, and when he lowered them, his eyes were wet in a way she'd only seen once before, in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and fear. 3 years, he said. "I have missed 3 years of my own children's lives, and you let me. I let you." The words came out sharper than she meant them to, 3 years of grief finally finding a target. "You signed the papers, Woojin. You stood in that hallway and you told me it was the only way, and then your grandmother's lawyer called me 40 minutes later to explain, very clearly, what would happen to me and to any child of mine if I ever tried to claim anything from your family again. Legally. Financially. Publicly." She used the word collateral. "About a baby she didn't even know existed yet. I didn't know that call happened. I know that now," she said, and hated how much it cost her to say it gently. "I didn't know it then. All I knew was that the man I married had looked me in the eye and chosen his family over me, and then his family made it very clear what would happen if I tried to fight for anything more. So I stopped fighting where they could see me. I built a life where they couldn't." He sat down on her porch steps like his legs had simply stopped being willing to hold him. "Did I choose it? Truly? Or did I sign what I was told to sign because I would have signed anything to keep the surgical team from walking out of my father's operating room?" It was the first time in 3 years anyone had asked the question out loud, and Kendra realized, standing over him in the porch light, that she had spent 3 years assuming she already knew the answer. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I think you'd better find out. Not for me. For them." She didn't invite him inside that night. But she told him the twins' bedtime was 7:30, and that if he wanted to be a father instead of a stranger with a familiar face, he would need to earn his way to 8 o'clock one evening at a time, starting with the truth, the whole truth, whatever it cost him to dig it up. Kendra just handed Woojin the hardest homework of his life: find out if he ever actually chose to leave her. If you were her, would you have opened that door at all? Tell me in the comments. I actually read every one. Grace Lin had left Kwon Group's legal department 11 months after Woojin's annulment, and for 3 years she had told herself the manila folder in her home safe was just insurance, not evidence, a thing she kept in case she ever needed it and never quite let herself imagine using. Woojin found her through a name buried in an old file transfer log, a deputy counsel who'd signed off on paperwork the week of his father's surgery, then resigned 4 months later with no public explanation. He called her from a parking garage at 11 at night, and when she didn't hang up on him immediately, he knew, with the particular dread of a man about to lose the last comfortable lie he had left, that there was something to find. They met the next afternoon in a coffee shop 2 towns over from Kwon Group's headquarters, and Grace slid the folder across the table before he'd finished his first sentence. "I should have brought this to you the day I quit," she said. "I told myself it wasn't my place. That was a coward's excuse, and I'm sorry." The documents inside told a story with a timeline Woojin recognized in his bones and details he'd never been allowed to see. The annulment paperwork he remembered signing, rushed, incomplete, presented to him by his grandmother's personal attorney while his father was still in surgery, was not the paperwork that had actually been filed. The filed version, dated 2 days later, included a financial settlement clause his grandmother's people had added after his signature, structured to look, to anyone who ever asked, like Kendra had negotiated a payout in exchange for a quiet exit. There had been no negotiation. Kendra had never seen a cent, never asked for one, never been offered the chance. Your grandmother told the board the marriage ended because your wife accepted a settlement to leave, Grace said. She told you the marriage had to end to protect the cardiac team's contract with the hospital board. Neither of those things happened. What happened is that she saw an opportunity, during the worst night of your life, to solve a problem she'd been trying to solve since your engagement, and she took it. What problem? You marrying an American who couldn't be controlled, Grace said, not unkindly. Diaki has spent 40 years believing that outsiders destroy families. She wasn't lying to hurt you specifically. She was protecting the only thing she knows how to protect, the only way she knows how to do it. Woojin sat with the folder open in front of him for a long time, watching his own signature under fluorescent coffee shop light, remembering a hallway, a heart monitor, a version of himself so frightened he would have signed away anything to keep his father breathing. His grandmother hadn't lied to him about the stakes. She had simply chosen, in the split second she had his fear in her hands, to point it at the wrong door. He called Kendra from the parking lot before he'd even reached his car, and when she answered, he didn't lead with an apology, because he understood, finally, that an apology wasn't what this moment required. I never chose to lose you, he said. I need you to know that before anything else happens. And I think my grandmother is about to find out that I know. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that he checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When Kendra finally spoke, her voice had a note in it he hadn't heard in 3 years, not relief, not yet, but the first crack of light under a door that had been sealed for a long time. Be careful, she said. She doesn't lose gracefully. Diaki moved fast, and she moved the way she always had, through other people's fear. Within 48 hours, Kendra's firm received a call from the city's development office informing her, with polite regret, that a funding review had flagged irregularities in Haven House's nonprofit financing, and that the project's permits would be placed on administrative hold pending investigation. Kendra had passed 4 audits in 3 years. She knew, within the first 10 minutes of the call, exactly whose fingerprints were on this. Talia found her staring at the email in the studio at 8 that night. She can't actually do this. Can she? She doesn't have to win, Kendra said. She just has to make it cost enough that I back away on my own. That's how she's always worked. That's how she got Woojin to sign those papers in the first place, not with a lie he'd never believe, but with a threat aimed at the thing he loved most. Woojin called an hour later, already halfway to the airport in Seoul, having heard about the funding hold from a board member trying to warn him before the story broke publicly. She's going to bring the merger vote forward, he said. Tomorrow morning instead of next month. She thinks if she moves fast enough, I won't have time to build a case against her before the board locks in behind her. What are you going to do? What I should have done 3 years ago. His voice was steadier than she expected, steadier than she'd ever heard it, actually, the voice of a man who had finally stopped negotiating with his own fear. I'm going to stand in front of the board that answers to her and tell them the truth, on the record, with Grace's documents in my hand. I need you to know what that costs, if it goes wrong. She could still win the vote. I could lose the company my father built. I am not asking you to wait and see if I'm worth the risk. I'm telling you I'm taking it either way, because the alternative is teaching my children that power is more important than the truth, and I already let that lesson cost us 3 years. Kendra sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment, looking at the 2 small shoes lined up by her front door, at the rooftop garden rendering pinned above her desk, at every version of a life she had built entirely on the principle that she would never again let someone else's fear make her decisions for her. I'm not asking you to protect me from this, she said finally. But if you're doing this, I want to be in the room. Not hiding in a hallway somewhere waiting to hear how it went. If our children's whole future is on that table tomorrow, I get a seat at it. The line was quiet for a second. Then, for the first time in the whole conversation, she heard something that sounded almost like relief in his voice. She's not going to know what hit her, he said. The Kwon Group boardroom on the 40th floor had seen 40 years of Diaki's decisions go unquestioned, and it had never once seen her outmaneuvered in her own conference room until the morning Woojin walked in 11 minutes early with Grace Lin on one side and Kendra Ashworth on the other. Diaki's composure didn't crack, not at first. She had built an empire on not cracking. "This is a board matter," she said, eyes flicking once, contemptuously, to Kendra. "Not a family reunion." "It's both," Woojin said, and set Grace's folder in the center of the table. "You're going to want to look at the actual annulment filing, grandmother. Not the one you told the board about. The one you filed 2 days after I signed, with a settlement clause I never agreed to and Kendra never received." The room went very still. Board members who had spent decades deferring to Diaki's version of events began, one by one, to read documents that told a different story than the one they'd been told for 3 years. "You were manipulated by grief," Diaki said to Woojin, low, urgent, the first genuine crack showing. "I protected this family the only way I knew how. I have always protected this family." "You protected an idea of this family," Woojin said. "One that couldn't survive the truth. I have 2 children who exist because of a lie you told in a hospital hallway while my father was dying, and I am done letting your fear write the rules for what my family is allowed to look like." It wasn't a clean victory. Diaki did not weep, did not repent on the spot, did not transform into a warm grandmother in the space of one boardroom confrontation. She was quieter, angrier, the kind of defeated that would take her months, maybe years, to fully sit with. But the board voted, 7-2, to remove her from operational authority over the merger, and to restore Haven House's funding within the hour, and by noon, the story that had controlled Woojin's entire adult life had finally, publicly, come apart at the seams it was built on. He found Kendra on the building's ground floor terrace afterward, still holding the folder like she wasn't sure the fight was really over. "I want to meet them properly," he said. "Not in an office lobby. Not by accident. I want to sit on the floor of wherever they feel safest and let them decide, in their own time, whether they want anything to do with me." That evening, on the living room rug of the house Kendra had built entirely on her own, Woojin Kwon sat cross-legged across from 2 children who studied him with matching dark eyes before Eli finally scooted forward and placed a crayon drawing in his lap, a small house with a wraparound porch and 2 heart-shaped windows, copied, without ever having seen the original, from the tie clip he'd noticed 3 weeks earlier. "That's Mommy's building," Eli said solemnly. "Do you want to help us color it?" Woojin's hands were not quite steady when he picked up the crayon. Across the room, Kendra watched a promise she'd drawn on a napkin a decade ago finally, fully, arrive home. Haven House opened 8 weeks later, its rooftop garden in full bloom, its heart-shaped windows catching the late afternoon sun exactly the way Kendra had always pictured them. Diaki did not attend, though the board seat she'd been stripped of remained pointedly, permanently empty. Woojin stood at the ribbon cutting with Eli on his shoulders and Yuna's hand wrapped tight around 2 of his fingers, and if anyone in the crowd wondered why the new CEO of Kwon Group looked less like a man cutting a ribbon and more like a man who'd just been handed his entire life back, no one asked him to explain it. Kendra had agreed to try, not to remarry in some rushed, cinematic gesture, but to let him earn, one 7:30 bedtime at a time, the trust 3 years had taken from him. It was slower than either of them wanted and steadier than either of them had dared hope for. It was 3 weeks after the opening, while helping Woojin clear out his father's untouched private office at Kwon Group's headquarters, that Kendra found the envelope. It was tucked behind a row of law books, yellowed slightly, sealed, addressed in handwriting Woojin recognized instantly and hadn't seen in 3 years, his father's. Not to Woojin. Not to Diaki. To my grandchildren, whenever they are found. The postmark inside the drawer where it had been filed was dated 4 days before his father's death, 9 days after Kendra had left the country, and, by every timeline anyone had ever given Woojin, weeks before anyone in the family could possibly have known she was pregnant. Someone had known before Woojin did. Someone had known before Diaki's lawyers had drafted a single page of the settlement she'd forged. And that someone had been trying, in his final failing days, to protect 2 grandchildren nobody was supposed to know existed yet, from the only person in the family with the power to hide them. Woojin stood in his father's office holding a letter meant for children who had never met the man who wrote it, and understood, with a cold and entirely new kind of dread, that his grandmother might not have been the only one keeping secrets in that hospital, and that some of them might still be waiting to come out. If you want to know what Woojin's father knew, and why he took it to his grave instead of telling his own mother, subscribe to Light Romance Stories, because episode 2 is coming for that letter. And tell me, if someone hid the truth to protect you, does the ending still justify how you got there?